you've been 17.
I am a vampire, and you are mortal.
Hello and welcome to This Podcast Sucks.
The show where we take a bite out of the vampire genre.
We'll be following all manner of fanged fiends through the past 127 years of film and television.
From Nosferatu to Twilight, I'm your host, Tara.
And I'm your host, Elliot.
All right, so today we will be talking about the pre-code 1933 film The Vampire Bat, directed by Frank R. Strayer, written by Edward T. Lowe Jr., cinematography by Ira H. Morgan, and produced by Phil Goldstone and Larry Darmore. So, the film stars Lionel Atwell as Dr. Otto von Neumann, Fay Wray as Ruth Burton, and Melvin Douglas as Carl Bretschneider. So, Elliot, had you had any knowledge or familiarity with this film before?
No, absolutely not. No.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's very shocking. Neither had I. Just a little context about the film here. So, the film was basically made as sort of a quickie, spooky film by Majestic Pictures to capitalize on the recent popularity of the horror film trend as popularized by Universal monster movies such as Dracula and Frankenstein. So this film was pretty much made as a quickie, spooky film by Majestic Pictures with the intent of capitalizing on the recent early 1930s horror boom popularity, moviegoers as popularized by the Universal monster movie pictures such as Dracula and Frankenstein. So this film was made pretty quickly, and some fun production notes about it. When it was made, they asked Frankenstein director James Wales to lease the peasant extras from the film Frankenstein for the film, which, wow. I don't know, Elliot, maybe we can now assess if the movie has better peasant extra authenticity now. They also used quite a bit more from the Frankenstein film, such as the Frankenstein German village set, which I thought was pretty cool because it was a very nice set. And for the interior shots of the doctor's house, they used the setting for the old dark house, which Frankenstein Connection is another movie that has Boris Karloff in it, I believe. So the film was released on January 10th, 1933, and yes, it is that short. The official runtime was 63 minutes. And so two of the stars in it, Fay Wray and Lionel Atwell, had already co-starred in the 1932 film Dr. X and had finished production on Mystery of the Wax Museum, which would come out later that month. So Majestic pretty much wanted to exploit the advanced press and was able to get the movie into theaters less than a month before Mystery of the Wax Museum was released. Mm-hmm. So there you go. That's pretty much about all I could find regarding this film. In terms of legacy, does it have one? I'm kidding. I would say it's legacy-wise, it's pretty much part of the 1930s classic pre-code horror film trend, albeit a B-tier one that was rushed by studios to capitalize on the trend. And there are actually some interesting themes, I think, that pop up in the movie, which we will get into in a little bit, particularly a theme that was emerging in films at the time regarding science, particularly the figure of the mad scientist, and topics of eugenics, which, as I said, we'll talk about a little bit later. But Elliot, what did you think?
Well, I think it's really, I had no idea these kind of like production crossovers and relationships with Frankenstein, because when I watched it, I think we're going to be talking about Frankenstein a lot while we talk about this film, because the kind of similarities between the two go pretty far beyond the extras. But yeah, I think that for the most part, it is those kind of themes and the sort of subtext of the film that I found a lot more compelling than than things like the story or the characters. Um, and there
Yeah.
were some technical issues, or like you said, it was made very quickly, but I will say that I found the cinematography, like the camera movement especially, to be, there were some really nice moments of camera movement, but otherwise I think you can tell that this movie did not necessarily have a lot invested in it.
Yes, I agree with that completely. When you read about the production history, you go, okay, that makes sense. And um, I also agree that the themes and some of the ideas that it introduces are much more interesting than the film itself, because the plot is basically a whodunit, and the
Hmm.
characters, I mean, calling them two-dimensional would probably be charitable.
Yes. Yeah.
We will get into that. Not that not that some of them weren't, giving it their all. I respect that.
Hmm.
But yes, it was a rushed film, and it was a film that I don't think was meant to like spark a dialogue or
No.
anything of that nature. But like I said, there's some interesting things that, in terms of the vampire genre and where we are in terms of the vampire film, that it does, that's new and interesting. And I think the film is a bit of a Trojan horse for some ideas, which I think is
Hmm.
cool. And yeah, so should we get into the plot, the
Yes, such
such
as
as
it
it
is.
is?
Yes, exactly, exactly.
Okay.
uh,
Okay, so um the film begins, plot wise, essentially. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the interesting initial shots, but the village of Kleinschloss has been experiencing attacks where the townspeople are dying of blood loss. And
mhm.
so some of the town fathers suspect a resurgence of vampirism, but police inspector Carl Brettschneider remains a bit skeptical.
Mhm.
So I have in my notes here, just even going back to the opening credits, I I wrote second picture of bat in background during credits because Dracula did it. Although I like this
Yes.
one more. It's much less Halloween party or Party City. Um, and yeah, in terms of the technicalities, like you were saying earlier with some of the camera movements, I really like the pan down
Mhm.
from the clock tower, which is the first image that we see.
Mhm.
And we start with a lot of low shots of buildings in the town. Leaves are rustling. There's a lot of shots of bats. The bat imagery in this film is quite a lot. There's a lot of bats
Yes.
in this movie.
Bats everywhere.
In case you forgot, you were watching The Vampire Bat.
Yes.
So,
And the bats are
so yeah,
huge. Like not all
bats
of
are
them.
huge.
Yeah, but in
I
that
mean,
first opening shot, I was like, man, those are big.
they're big bats, and given where the film was kind of going in the beginning, I was like, okay, are they actually going to have like a scientific bat related reason? It's not going to be supernatural that they're doing. But yes, we get a lot of really good atmospheric shots of this very nice German village set, which, as we know, was also used in Frankenstein.
Mhm.
And then we see a mysterious figure leaping on roofs, like Batman, sort of. Mm. Yeah, I thought that was when I still thought there was a vampire in this. I was like, okay, yay, we finally get our vampires that crawl on
Spoilers.
buildings.
Spoilers. What do you mean
Oh,
there's not a vampire in this?
I'm so sorry, everyone. I guess the film's been out for over 90 years, and I shouldn't do
Yes, yeah.
spoilers like that.
If you cared about the vampire bat, you would have seen it by now.
Yes, we will put a hefty spoiler warning in our description for the episode. Um, so we cut to the scene with all of kind of the town fathers or the town leaders,
Mhm.
and they are all basically kind of in full paranoid superstition mode of like,
Mhm.
vampires are at large, I tell you. And they're pretty, I think, clearly framed in opposition to the detective, oh, what was his name again? Carl. I'm just going to call him
Yes.
Carl. To
Yes.
Detective
Let's do
Carl, who's
first
very
names.
much, yeah, who's very much of the rational modern man. I'm a
Hmm.
scientist, and
Hmm.
um, so yeah, kind of. I don't know if you thought this was interesting as well, but what I really liked was kind of in this town meeting, they aren't just being like, "Oh my gosh, no vampires! That's definitely it." They're bringing up these town records that refer to supposed vampire attacks in,
Hmm.
they say 1643, which that's a thing. That's
Hmm.
historically there have been periods where there have been quote unquote vampire panics uh, in Europe, and I believe in the U.S. as well, even where deaths were happening or mysterious illnesses, and
Hmm.
vampirism was sometimes blamed on a person who had died recently. And so I just thought it was kind of interesting that the town was bringing
Yeah.
up, whether this is true or not, I don't think this is a real town, but they were bringing up actual vampire attacks to kind of justify this paranoia. Um, and, the detective is counteracting that by saying, okay, well,
Hmm.
yeah, there's vampire bats in South America. So there's like kind of this initial like, whoa, okay, they're actually like kind of sciencing here a bit.
Yeah, I think what's interesting to me about this scene is how familiar it feels. Like even in Nosferatu and then both Draculas, we tend to have these scenes where there's like a group of men sitting around a
Mm-hmm.
table debating, and there's the sort of like there's kind of always this tension, I think, of a bit more of like an urban versus rural, or like a
Mm-hmm.
provincial versus kind of modern thing, where there's always,
Mm-hmm.
like the older men who are kind of the ones who, and this isn't a town or maybe even a city, but they're the older generation. They're the ones who are like remembering the history. And then there's always like a younger kind of, and it's usually been like a police detective or inspector or something, but then there's someone who's like, you old superstitious fools. So
Mm-hmm.
it that in that way it felt familiar, but um I did think it was interesting that, because in I think in Dracula it was like the guy was like, I think it's vampires because of the science and the science of
Mm-hmm.
vampires. And in
Mm-hmm.
this one they're like, well, it can't be vampires because there is no scientific evidence of, like, that's an urban legend, or that's a myth. Or even if vampires are real, that's not the problem here. So you're right that there was an interesting kind of tension there between, like, the history and like and the science of of that contemporary moment. I was going to say the future, but it's 90 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think I have here in my notes because I didn't. The detective does come across as a little jerky in this
Hmm.
scene,
Oh
and
yeah.
then I wrote, yeah, I mean, he's like body shaming one of them. And then I wrote, in fairness, if I was a detective trying to solve multiple murders, I too would probably be frustrated with the insistence of a supernatural answer like vampires.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, if I was a
yeah.
cop and there were like, not that I would ever be that, but if I was a cop and like five people had died and everyone I talked to was like, well, it's the ghost, I would be like, we need to like we need to deal with this.
Like,
Like,
what?
take this seriously, please.
Yes, exactly. So, we next come cut to the um, Doctor. Let's see, Doctor Otto. Again, we're using first names here.
Hmm.
Doctor Otto's house and his chemistry lab basement, which I write, yay, 1930s chemistry lab of beakers and dry ice.
Yes. There's like
So
one flask that you see the whole
there's like
time.
one. It's like always randomly bubbling. You don't know
Yes.
what's in it.
Yeah.
But it's a familiar sight, and we love to see it.
Hmm.
And then we get our introduction to the queen herself, Fay Ray. So, for any
Hmm.
of our listeners who don't know, I went through kind of a hardcore King Kong phase when I was 10 or 11. I was
Wow.
yeah, well no, like I'm serious. It was over like it lasted well over a year, but I was
Mm-hmm.
obsessed with the Peter Jackson version, and that's kind of the movie that I was first really obsessed with, and I remember kind of made me love films and the process of filmmaking because I remember for Christmas I really wanted like the 4 disc special edition of it, and so it was just
Mm-hmm.
hours and hours of behind the scenes footage and documentary and production about the making of
Mm-hmm.
this film.
Mm-hmm.
And I just ate that up and I loved it. But I also, of course, consumed a lot of other versions. One of which being the 19, I think, yeah, King Kong was 1931 or 32. Yeah, it might be 30. It's a pretty old movie. Um, but yes, I watched that one extensively, in which Fay Wray starred as Anne Darrow, and was
Mm-hmm.
kind of she became a bit of a scream queen, and she played similar sort of roles in horror films after that. And so I was just happy to see her familiar face. She's so beautiful, and yeah, she's in the lab. And for a brief second, I was like, "Oh my gosh, are we having a female scientist here?" But
I thought the
um,
same.
nope. Real quick, awkward kiss, and by Detective um, Carl. Yeah, thanks,
Yes.
Carl.
He
Okay,
really
but
he like sneaks up on her.
he sneaks up, and then he does like. Granted, we get a lot of those like hard quick kisses in like
Mm-hmm.
1930s film, but yes, he does sneak up, and it's very sudden. And I write, "Oh damn, quick kiss."
Mm-hmm.
And then is Faye a scientist? No. And then in my notes, God, I don't like this guy. He loves being the smartest person in the room.
Yeah. Yeah. And
So,
he continues
yes.
to be pretty pushy throughout the film. Like he has one moment in particular where I'm like, just chill out, Carl. Like
Yes.
just calm down.
Yes, but we need a self-insert character for the male audience members of the time,
Oh. Yeah. Yeah.
pretty much. But yeah, so then I believe trying to see from my notes of the summary. So I think this is when we cut to the other main character of scientist Dr. Otto von Niemann, played by his name was, I believe, yes, Lionel Atwill. So he is the scientist slash kind of doctor in the town. He's really good with the victims and cares for them. And he visits one of the patients, Martha Mueller, who has been losing blood due to a supposed attack by a bat.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, and out of appreciation for her kindness, Martha is visited by a highly eccentric man named Herman Glebe, who claims he likes bats because they are soft like cat and nice. And so I have in my notes, Dwight Fry, yay, he's back, King. And so for our listeners who don't know, Dwight Fry played Renfield in the 1931 Bela Lugosi Dracula. It's probably his most iconic role. It typecast him a bit. And so
Mm-hmm.
afterwards, he was always kind of playing, I don't know, what's the term now? Weird little dudes.
Weird little dudes. Yeah, I think we're
Weird little
gonna.
dudes.
Yeah, I have a lot to say about Herman and when we get to him.
Yeah.
Even that
Yes.
description of him as a highly eccentric man, I find interesting. But
Yes.
this is a bit of a rewind to Lionel Atwill and Dr. Otto von Niemann. I feel like, did you think he was hot? I felt like he was hot.
Okay. I'm so glad you. I'm so glad you're raising. I'm so glad you're raising the important questions here, Elliot. Because yes,
Yes.
he was hot, and while watching the film, I was getting such a Christopher Plummer, Captain Von Trapp vibe from him, a bit. Like I could see it in the face a little bit.
Hmm.
Have
Yeah,
you
I
seen
just.
The Sound of
I
Music?
Oh, okay. I was like, no, I haven't seen The Sound of Music.
Sorry.
I'm not like you know this. I'm not a huge musicals person. So yes, I've seen The Sound of Music, but
Mm.
it's been a while.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yes, I thought I was surprised by how like sexy the villain was in this. I guess that's a spoiler,
Yeah.
but they try not to make the. Well, I guess Bela Lugosi is like hot in his own way, but like with all the makeup and stuff, it's like
Yeah.
less so. Um,
Yeah. this guy is just, the hottest dude in the village. And
Yeah, he and Carl are in fierce competition with each other
yeah,
under the
I know.
surface.
No, like seriously, watching like towards the end of the film, I'm like, oh my gosh, Faye,
Yeah.
just get with Otto.
Yes, yeah.
I feel
Of
like he
course.
respects you. I feel like he respects you more. He would probably be happy to have you as,
Yeah.
an assistant doctor, help you pass those med exams.
Yeah. And she seems to like him more. Like whenever Carl is
Yes.
around, she's always
Okay.
like, "No,
Pushing him
like
up. Yeah, like
yeah."
that's another interesting thing we'll talk about. But
Mhm.
yeah, so so yes, we have the introduction of Dr. Otto, the victim Martha, who is slowly dying of blood loss,
Mhm.
and the character of Herman, who like I believe I think this is pretty much in the text, who I believe is an intellectually disabled character, or is at
Mhm.
least implied to be. Um, so, yes. And the townspeople, let's see, are starting to become more anxious and afraid of who is causing this mysterious blood loss. On the
Mhm.
doctor's journey home, he meets Kringen, one of the townsfolk, who claims to have been attacked by the vampire in the form of a
Mhm.
bat, but withheld his story from the town in order not to spread fear.
Mhm.
So Dr. von Niemann, or Dr. Otto, as I should say, encourages Kringen to tell the townsfolk his story. And so Kringen starts to become suspicious that Herman may be a vampire due to his obsession with bats, and because Herman lives with bats and collects them off the streets.
Mhm.
Um, so this is when I have in my notes, okay, it seems like they're most likely setting Herman up as a red herring, because if he's like actually the bad boy, or not the bad boy,
The bad boy.
for Freudian slip. I'm sorry, I just love Dwight so much. If he's actually the bad guy, oh boy, we're getting into like some problematic territory here. Um, yes,
Yes, I think we're in that territory, and we'll get
we
into this.
are, yes, we
We're
are already well in
firmly in
there.
that territory. Yeah,
We
but
would
it
be
would take it
more
to a yeah,
like another
exactly.
tumble into a further layer of problematic.
Yeah.
Yes, if Herman was actually the big bad.
Mhm.
So I wrote, they're probably setting Herman up as a bit of a red herring. We get some more
Mhm.
shots of bats. Again, a prominent motif in this movie. So, yes, when Kringen starts to suspect Herman and he's voicing these suspicions, we get a shot of the townspeople kind of crowding around watching Herman, which I didn't like. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, and Kringen says, he isn't human, I tell you. And I
Yeah.
wrote it that it's interesting that Kringen, the only one who's wearing, I think, more kind of traditional quote unquote peasant or rural attire,
Yeah.
is the one who says this. So, yeah, I
Yes.
don't know
What
if
is
that's
the
a bit of visual
full
shorthand.
Yeah, it's like what the full line is something it's okay, I can't find it, but yeah, there is some sort of weird line about him. Like, yes, he isn't human, I tell you, he's in league with the devil. Um and yeah, I did not love that line either, and it is
Yeah.
concerning that that Dr. Otto and Carl can both see the way that the townspeople are starting to scapegoat Herman and become obsessed with
Mm-hmm.
Herman, and that none of them really like do much, where they're like, "Oh, he seems like a nice guy. He brought an old
Well,
woman a flower." And but
yeah. I
they're not
mean, in
really
Dr.
doing
Otto's
anything
case, it's
else.
good for him. Well, in Dr. Otto's case, it's
Yeah,
good for him.
true. Yeah.
He's like, yeah, definitely scapegoat this guy. Because, anyway, so Dr. Otto returns to his house, where we come back to Ruth, who's Fay Ray's character and is Carl's love interest. And we also, I
Mhm.
forgot to say, are meet her hypochondriac aunt, Gussie
Yes.
Schnappman, who I liked this woman.
Yeah, I did too. She was
she
great.
she was living in her own world. She was just
Yeah.
not bothering with any of this foolishness. And so uh, let's see. Fear of the vampire and suspicion of Herman has quickly spread around the town, and people start fearing him. And that night, excuse me, that night, Martha Mueller, who Dr. Otto had visited earlier, is killed.
Hmm.
So I wrote, I really liked this point of view tracking shot to Martha, where the camera
Yes.
kind
Yeah.
of slowly approaches and then quickly zooms in, sort of, and the
Hmm.
shadow comes over her and she screams.
Hmm.
And I thought that was pretty effective.
I
Um,
really like that shot as well. I noted it down too because, and I like it's pretty clever the way they do it. I think this is one of the first moments of foreshadowing where Otto is going through a doorway and we follow him through the doorway and then the cut is hidden and then we're in the pan to
mm,
Martha in the bed. So like that implied movement is I thought was very nicely done. There's some nice crane shots and things. So like whoever they got for the cinematography was really bringing something to the table that the director
yeah.
was not.
Yeah, I think, yeah, we've been so scarred by the Bela Lugosi Dracula now whenever we see a camera move, like it's so beautiful.
Yeah, we're like amazing.
You,
The
cameras
magic
can
of cinema.
move.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. But yeah, no, I agree. Some really interesting, nice shots in this movie, especially the one we were just discussing. So let's see. We then cut to um, Dr. Otto and another doctor concluding that the death of Martha is the same as all the previous deaths, which is from blood loss. And there are two punctures in her neck, they say, caused by needle sharp teeth.
Hmm.
Interesting how it's like clearly teeth. It's like needle sharp teeth. It's not needles, it's needle sharp teeth.
And that
It's
sounds
like,
kind of like
yeah.
small for teeth, you know? Like,
I mean, yes, I know needles can be different sizes. I don't know
that's
if in the
true.
30s they had much larger needles, possibly. Um, yeah, and I think this is the scene where I just I wrote this down. It was so funny. Where Carl, the detective, says, "I don't mind admitting that I'm up a tree, stumped." just, I just love it. 1930s dialogue. I mean, oh my
Nice.
gosh.
Yeah,
So,
there was an interesting interplay between like drama, horror, and comedy because there are
yeah.
definitely some comedic moments, and then obviously like Aunt Gussie, who is like a kind of played as a ridiculous hypochondriac.
Hmm. Oh
Like
yeah, I mean, she
she's
gets the last
absolutely for
word.
laughs. Yeah, she
Yeah, she gets
literally
that at the
gets.
end of the
Yeah,
movie. I was just like, oh, okay, not totally distant at all. But I think
yeah.
that speaks to also, just it being a rush film, but also it's a
Hmm.
studio film, and as we know, studio films appeal to every single demographic, basically.
Yeah,
So, be a horror, be a drama,
yeah,
be a thriller, be a comedy.
and I think that's probably also a technique to kind of avoid scrutiny in terms of like horror and graphicness of like, oh,
Mm,
we have this
yeah.
really possibly like horrific or violent moment and we're just gonna like undercut that or distract from that with a joke.
Right, kind of inserting this levity to, as you
Yeah,
say, distract from the actual horror of what happened.
yeah, the
Which,
actual
yeah,
interesting part.
the actual interesting part, so, we're not in any trouble. And so Herman enters this examination by the two doctors, and, there's a big crowd of the townspeople around them. He enters, and upon seeing the dead body, runs away screaming. Um, so, yeah, just checking my notes here. Uh, I think
Yes,
I wrote,
because
damn, Dwight. Mm-hmm.
he was close to her, like when the doctor is there to
Yeah.
see her, he comes in like we mentioned earlier, he gives her a flower and the nurse attending to her says like, "Oh, he's here all the time." Like he, apparently she was a very kind woman. So Herman likes to
Mm-hmm.
visit her and so I actually thought it was kind of sweet that he sees that she's died and is so upset by this.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it shows he's very sensitive, and
Yeah.
it's a heartbreaking reaction that sadly like the filmmakers are framing it as a, oh, look how there's something wrong with him, is he
Yeah.
the villain, they do
Yeah.
this horrific thing. Yeah, and just kind of further going on with the problematic Herman pipeline here.
The
The next
Mermaid Pipeline.
morning, Yes, because like the next
No,
morning,
yeah.
her Fay Wray's character Ruth is, sitting in the garden all pretty la di
Hmm.
da, because that's what she does a lot. She sits and stands quietly.
Yes, yeah.
But sorry, Faye, we still love you. But yes, and Herman, kind of framed again. This is how the film is framing it. Is like very creepily looking at her,
Yes.
like through the gate, I think, and he gets like a creepy smile when he
Hmm.
sees her, because the filmmakers want the audience to go, "Oh no!" Like he's basically some kind of monster that's going to
Yeah.
attack like
Yeah.
the pretty white lady.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and so he sneaks in, I believe, and um, this, let's see, this is where we come back to Carl.
Oh,
Carl
yeah.
and Rory not their romance, because Carl approaches, and again he's all about surprise kissing, I guess, this one,
Yeah.
but Ruth is saying it's too early for kisses, and she's like cheekily trying to fend him off a bit. She says, "Close your
Hmm.
eyes." She gets an orange room to kiss. I don't know, maybe this was cracking the audiences of 1933 up, but
Yeah, it's like we do get the sense because she kisses him and she seems happy to see him sometimes, but he to me he just comes across as very pushy, you know? Like he kind of is like he definitely is in that mindset of a bit of a like no means convince me. Um
yeah,
yeah,
which unfortunately common then,
yes.
but
I do,
yeah.
but I will say I find the idea of like it's too early in the morning to kiss like really funny. Like you never need a reason to not want to kiss someone, obviously, but just to be like it's too early for like chaste closed mouth kisses on the terrace.
I know. Yeah, no, it's so funny, and it just, makes me think that this woman is not really that interested, dude.
Yeah.
Um so then we get the hypochondriac aunt comes out again. What was her
Hmm.
name? I'm trying to remember her name. Oh, Gussie.
Gussie. Yeah, Aunt Gussie.
Yes, Gussie comes out again, and I just love how funny she is. She's clearly like the overprotective parental figure for Ruth, and she's
Hmm.
like, "You can't wait for me to be, gone so you can have her." And she's like, "Well, I'm not gone yet." So I wrote that I love this woman. Um,
Yeah.
so we then cut to Dr. Otto,
Hmm.
and let me see.
Well, there was
Yes.
actually another moment that I thought was kind of interesting is that
Mm-hmm.
before she comes out, we see her kind of going to the doctor and she's like, "Oh no, I think I have like a ventricular like thing." And he's like,
Yeah,
"Oh, you mean your
she's always
heartbeat?" Yeah.
yeah, she's always listing these, using the medical
Hmm.
terminology for
Yeah.
things like heart
Yeah.
palpitations.
And then we cut back to Carl and Ruth and he says to her, "You have a heart of stone." So I thought that was
Mm.
that was a nice little moment of like they're talking about hearts in both scenes and
Yeah,
yeah.
that's true. Mm-hmm. And so we have Dr. Otto. Let's see. He is discussing with Carl the topic of vampires, and I have in my notes. Cool. Dr. Neiman is referencing an actual work. That actual work being, pulling up the title right here. So it was, the title's in French, and the doctor says the original French title in the
Hmm.
film, but the actual title is Treatise on the Apparitions of Spirits and on Vampires or Revenants of Hungary, Moravia, etc., by a monk called Antoine Augustin Calmet. And
Wow.
so, yeah, I thought
Very
that was
cool
really
that you
neat.
hunted that down.
I did. So, yeah, I guess that was pretty much a text from, let me see, it was written around, um, the 18th century. Yes, it says it was published in 1751, and this was, at least on, I'm assuming, the part of the monk's view. This was a scientific account
Hmm.
of the religious topics of things like angels and demons, but also supernatural entities such as ghosts and vampires, and kind of, I think, creating this sort of compendium of accounts of, their occurrences in different parts of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, really cool. Dr. Otto is referencing this. And I think this is where the film introduces a really neat idea I hadn't thought about before, where they're talking about whether vampires are actually in embodied form or they just are the spirit of the corpse.
Yes.
Which I wrote was really interesting.
Yeah, I also wrote that down because that's something that has kind of been... This is the first time that it's been that explicit, but that is something that's kind of come up in some of the past films of like, oh, they can pass through keyholes or walls or, like sometimes Dracula can turn into like a cloud of, like a fog. So I think it was interesting that they were talking about, oh, well, we have these murders and like people are losing their blood and like, could a murder be committed by something without a physical form? And so, yeah, it is an interesting kind of conversation that they have.
Yeah, and I just like that it made me think about, oh, wow, it kind of reintroduces, I think, like the philosophical, topic that is common in vampire media of like, do we have souls anymore or not when we become a vampire? And it's like, this is just taking it to like even a further physical level of like, when you become a vampire, you don't even have your body anymore, sort of. You're just, as Dr. Otto puts it, I think you reintegrate it essentially outside of the grave, which... Again, yes. So cool and interesting.
Is this the scene where he says, an evil soul, if such a thing exists, can take any form?
Yes.
Yeah, and I thought that inclusion of if such a thing exists is really interesting because
he's a man of science.
Yeah, and it also makes sense for like what we learn about him later in the film, that he might be someone whose morality system is not really built around good and evil the way most people's are, or the way most kind of religious kind of things are. So I thought that was a very interesting line, that there was this implication that evil might just not be a thing at all.
Yes, I agree. And so then the town fathers enter the house and announce that Kringen, the character that was wearing peasant garb and who thought Herman might be the vampire or the one causing the murders, they announce that he is dead and that Herman is missing. And so an angry mob begins to hunt Herman down, and this whole scene made me so sad.
Yeah, especially because Herman was not actually missing. Gussie had seen him in the garden like mere moments before, and she didn't say anything when these men were like, Herman, like, she's died, Herman is gone, like we have to hunt him down. And they even say what they're gonna do to him. They say they're gonna kill him and put a stake through his heart, and she just stands there and watches, and she doesn't say that she gave him an apple like a couple minutes ago.
No one shows up for Herman in this movie, and it's sad and kind of speaks to just attitudes and mores of the time. But yeah, we get our mob chasing Herman scene, and it's just, it's just like sad because it's like, this is, was common-ish in horror films of the time, but it's like these mobs were always chasing monsters, like, or supernatural kind of entities, and here it's man, which is very upsetting and problematic, and
it's
sad
like
to see.
You're right that we've had like, this kind of reminded me a lot of Renfield being chased, but like Renfield had kind of done in Nosferatu, like Renfield had kind of like been surviving off of insects and is obsessed with drinking blood and was supernaturally powerful. So, like for Herman, it's like, you're right, he is just an intellectually or developmentally disabled man. And so to have him, you're totally right that this framing of like a near identical scene to, a gang chasing like a werewolf or something.
Or Frankenstein.
Is pretty upsetting.
And I would argue even in some movies, like you feel like you're supposed to feel more sympathy for the monster, like Frankenstein. And so They chase Herman, and Herman, I believe, intentionally leaps to his
Yeah.
death rather
Yes.
than being caught. It is the second time we see Dwight Fry fall to his death.
And he
Although in Dracula,
says, yeah, he says Herman afraid multiple times before he jumps, which was really sad.
I need to see a movie where Dwight Fry is happy. But yes, it's very sad, and it makes you angry. So Herman falls to his death, and that night it is revealed that it is actually Dr. Otto. What? Who has been causing the murders? And that he is
How
actually
could he?
Did we miss any signs? And that he's actually telepathically controlling Emil Borst in very Dr. Caligari and Cesare fashion. He is controlling Emil Borst, who, okay, answer me this. Did we ever see this guy before?
No, he came from
okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely
Yes,
nowhere.
okay.
I was like, who is this
I
man?
was like, who is he? Yeah.
Yeah, and everyone's
He
like,
just
oh,
shows up. I was
Emil,
like, what?
hello. Yeah, and it's like, we don't
Hi,
know
Emil.
him.
Again, like, movies still needed to work out the kinks of how characters were introduced in movies.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he is seen telepathically controlling new character Emil Borst. And Emil picks up another sleeping townswoman, Georgiana, and takes her back to Dr. Otto's laboratory, where a strange organism is seen, and they then drain her blood from her neck. So
organism is a strong word for what we see.
For a breathing sponge.
Yes,
so,
in a fish tank.
In a fish tank. It was kind of reminding me of, have you seen The Iron Giant?
Like the kids movie?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Like, it takes place in the 50s during, the Red Scare and the Cold War and everything.
Yeah.
And so, like, there's a scene where Hogarth's watching, like, a B science fiction film.
Oh, of course.
And there's, like, that weird,
and
like,
there's
that sponge thing. Yeah.
It's a brain. Isn't it a brain?
Yes. Okay. That is what this scene was making me think of.
That's so funny. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I just have in my notes, okay, we're using the POV shots again for when this person is being telepathically controlled, which is pretty cool. And I really liked the cross cutting between Dr. Otto, who's doing the mind controlling. He's kind of sitting at his desk and, just staring blankly out and voicing his commands to the action that's happening. It's, like, interesting where he says she's no better than the rest. And
oh, yeah.
Yeah, which again feeds back into this kind of superiority thing, and this I live outside of
justify
normal.
The means.
The ends justify the means. I live outside of a normal moral code that most people have. So we come, and then we're back in the laboratory again with all of our beakers and dry ice, and I write, "What's that weird breathing pod in the water?"
Yes,
and
that blob.
What is that sponge? Then I write, whoa, it's getting medical horror here, which I think this movie is. This movie's pretty much a vampire film as a Trojan horse for a mad scientist horror film.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. The idea of vampires is sort of like the tease to get you in the room.
Right.
Yeah.
Because, they're popular. But yeah, this is more accurately... Excuse me. This is more accurately a mad scientist horror film. And then I also just write in my notes, wouldn't it be less work to just have your minion drain her blood while she's in her bed?
I wrote the same thing of kidnapping a person, bringing them to the basement lab, draining their blood, and then bringing them all the way back to where they were kidnapped from is like such an incredible amount of work. And it's like,
it is.
Yeah. And like at the time, I don't think that this is an interesting question, but like we definitely did not have DNA evidence. That was decades to come. I think we might have had fingerprints though. So
yeah, I think fingerprints were a thing then.
Let's see here. I'm on the wiki page because like it's not only is it a lot of work, I guess, thinking because this guy is basically a serial killer,
oh yeah.
Or like you'd think that he doesn't seem fully insane in the sense that he's not aware of the fact that people might be trying to figure out these murders. So you'd think that there would be some consideration of like, do I want to leave evidence? Like, and clearly he stokes the fires of the suspicion of Herman. So it's just a ridiculous amount of work to go through. But I think maybe history. There we go. History. Oh, wow. Okay, so it goes pretty far back, but in terms of like actually using them for kind of record keeping and maybe criminal investigations, it looks like it would have been like the late 1800s. So fingerprints would have existed then, but you know, I think that they probably wouldn't have been in full usage, you know, like that integration. Yeah, the first case using fingerprints for identification and arrest and conviction was in 1902. So that's a little aside, but I totally agree. I was just like, this is so complicated.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. And I mean, I don't even think it's an issue of, well, only the lab has the specific medical equipment we need. It's like, you just need her blood. You can bring
just
some
need a knife and a bucket.
Do it the old-fashioned way. Do it the very let the right one in way.
Yes.
Of like
Why does
hoisting
he
them
think
upside.
he's? Oh God. Yes.
Hoisting
Chilling.
them upside down. Yeah. Oh, we'll get to let the right one in. So then, let's see. Carl discovers Georgiana's body in her bed, and Dr. Otto and Carl investigate and find Martha's crucifix, which Herman had the night Dr. Otto visited her. So Carl is now starting to become more convinced that, okay, maybe it is a vampire in the village, because they're kind of exhausting all plausible explanations. And I think while they're discussing this, they're in Dr. Otto's house. Ruth is there as well. This moment. And they have coffee. And Dr. just says to Ruth, "Will you pour?" And I write in my notes, well, she is a woman. Got to make her good for something.
Yeah, it is, because I was so excited when I thought that she was the lab was hers, and so you know, I was like in the and I was hopeful that maybe she would have things to do, because you know she's not a total pushover, as we see with her relationship with Carl. So you know, she kind of but she is it sucks, but she is kind of just there to be pretty in a lot of instances.
Yes. Like a lot of female actors in movies at that time. That's not to Fay Wray is essentially a sexy lamp in this movie.
Yes.
But also I want to stress that is certainly not to negate a lot of the work that these leading actresses were doing in these horror films at the time. There is a really great book that I read when I was doing a project in my master's program called Women in Horror Films in the 1930s, that kind of does profiles on 21 of these actresses and the movies they were in, like Frankenstein, Dracula, King Kong, things like that. And it details really, like, it fleshes these women out as like professionals, people who like knew the business they were in and knew the roles they were playing, and kind of like it's like a really interesting deep dive into like the process of making these films. Because yes, while we would like to, you know, in 2024 see more depth in our female characters, like they were still doing good work, and they were creating I would say still memorable characters, or providing memorable performances within the confines of the characters that they had. Because that's the thing with a lot of these horror films, there was always a damsel, pretty much. And
she is not a bad actress in this role, and this is it's not a bad character, it's just a bad role. Like they just didn't give her anything to do.
So I mean, like, this is one of the worst of the like the poorer examples of those kinds of roles. there's some, like, again, Fay Wray and King Kong, iconic
Mhm.
performance, iconic scream. Yeah, and other actors. But yeah, also a side note, I just really love Ruth's dress in this scene. I was like, oh, it's just like the black and
Yes.
white.
She's very
It was fitting
beautiful
her.
throughout the whole
It
film.
was.
Yeah.
Yes, she is. And the dress was, she was wearing it well. I appreciate that. Um, so something else I also wrote in my notes, I don't know if you caught this as well, but this is, even though we know it is not a vampire who is committing these murders, I wrote that what's interesting is that up to this point, it's really only been older women that
Yes.
that we have seen die.
Yeah.
And so that's uncommon because in most vampire media, it is, I feel like, typically more so women that are preyed upon. And
or
it is
younger
typically
men.
it is younger men. But yeah, in both cases, men or women, they are typically young.
Yeah.
Kind of feeding into this idea of like youth, blood, life. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, it was interesting that these two characters that we know were killed by Dr. Otto were older women. So
Yeah, it is interesting because he clearly sees himself, as we talked about, as this person who's like above others, and that like the rules shouldn't apply to him. And it is interesting that he preys on the women least able, the people least able to defend themselves. And it's like, it speaks to his cowardice, you know, and his cruelty, that he's like,
yes,
you know, that these are the people in society that he views as most disposable, as like elderly women.
yeah. So Carl hears about Herman's death, more accurately murder, and his conviction
Yes.
his conviction that it's a vampire pretty much is like, oh, okay, no, what's going on here? Dr. Otto tells Carl, you know, go home, take a sleeping pill. And I wrote in my notes, he takes out a bottle, and in all caps it just says poison.
Poison.
I was screaming.
Yes,
Oh
it's
my
very reminiscent of Vampire, and the same
Yes, I was
thing.
thinking that
Yeah,
too.
where
I was
there's
like, but
this
it's like
big
10
bottle.
times worse. It's like, in
Yeah.
case you didn't know from the skull and crossbones, we have it
Yeah.
in all caps for you here.
And
it's
then
like,
underneath
just
it
poison.
says sleeping pills, and it's like, okay, well, like,
What's-
like the eternal
which is
sleep.
it?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, so that was hilarious.
Yes.
So, yes. Yeah, so clearly Dr. Otto is planning to kill him, take his blood. Burton, and again, this is the character that was introduced literally like 2 seconds ago, and we don't know who he is, but he is the one Dr. Otto controls telepathically. Wait, no. Okay. My summary here is saying Burton is different from Borst, who Dr. Otto telepathically controls. Okay, I'm just going to assume Burton is like...
I think Burton is the
like
guy
a townsfather?
who comes. Yeah, I think he's the guy who comes to tell them what happened to Herman.
Okay.
And and then he says, and then Carl is like, well, that doesn't make sense because, like, we just found the body of this woman. And he immediately is like, what have we done? And it's obviously too little too late, but he's clearly like, what have we done? Like, this is shameful. And he says that he's going to go recover Herman's body for a proper burial because it's the least they can do.
Yeah, I mean, Carl was showing up for Herman a bit there, so yay. But a little too late.
Yes.
So, Burton, Borst, they both start with B. So Burton discovers Dr. Otto telepathically controlling Borst, who is at his house, and it is revealed that Dr. Otto has created an artificial life form in blood to feed this organism. So, okay, wait, hold on. I'm so sorry. Again, this is what happens when your summary uses last names. Burton is the last name of Ruth. Okay, so we're talking about Ruth here.
Okay, cool. Yes, because I was thinking, doesn't Ruth find him?
Yes. So kind of coming back to when Dr. Otto is doing his telepathy again, we get the POV shot, the slowly approaching figure. Well, actually, it's not a POV shot. I think it's a shot of Carl in bed. It's kind of a
Oh, and he's smoking in bed, which I fucking loved. I was like, yes, this is everything.
Carl doesn't give a fuck.
Yeah, he's like in his massive 4-poster bed and he's got a cigarette.
God knows how old all the like that house has a
Yeah.
burn rate, Elliot. I guarantee you of 2 minutes.
Yeah,
Like,
at best, but the
At best,
glamour of it.
yes. Don't smoke in bed, kids.
Yeah,
we
don't
see
smoke
the slowly-
indoors.
Yeah, even better. So we see the slowly approaching Borst, who is being telepathically controlled, which was so reminiscent of the shot of Nosferatu, I felt like, when he was approaching
Yes, yeah.
Thomas in bed. And so then we see that Ruth has caught Dr. Otto in his moment of telepathic mind control. Oops. And so he notices her, comes out, and she's just like very dramatically, you're the one. And I just wanted Dr. Otto to be like, surprise, bitch.
Yeah, he doesn't, he has like no reaction. That would have been, just like, no matter how anachronistic that would have been, it would have been better than what actually happened. I mean, the directing is just like, he just stares at her and then kind of like grabs her face, sort of. Or like,
Yeah, I mean, like, it's Lionel Atwell. He's like, I'm a British thespian here. I'm gonna start using that. And he goes like full like 180 mad scientist, like, life, I've created life, like full like in our mad scientist mode, because that's like that's what happens when you're a villain and you have to be nice. You're nice, and then when they find out you're not nice, complete 180, you're a different person.
Yeah, I did like his line. He has like, you're right, that he has this kind of moment where he gives this like little monologue almost, and one of the lines that he had that I really liked was, I have lifted the veil. And I thought that was kind of cool. I liked that.
Yeah, it's a good little mad scientist speech. So he ties Ruth up in the lab with the intent of draining her blood, and then Borst, his little puppet, enters with Carl's body on a trolley. The meat puppet enters with Carl's body on a trolley. So Dr. Otto walks over to Borst, who is then revealed to actually be Carl, who did not take the pills from the large bottle that said poison on it.
Yes,
good, that's good.
Yeah.
He was Borst in disguise, and the real Borst was on the trolley. So Carl pulls a gun on Dr. Otto and walks over to untie Ruth. Dr. Otto then wrestles with Carl, who drops the gun, and as the two fight, Borst picks up the gun and shoots Dr. Otto before shooting himself. Oh my goodness. So in my notes, I was still pretty confused who Borst was, and so I just wrote, who is this third wheel in my...
Who is this third wheel?
Yeah, I was like, wait, what? And so, yes, Dr. Otto is killed and defeated. Ruth and Carl embrace. The breeding pair can go forth unfettered. And then we end with Gussie the ant coming down saying she's having some like indigestion or probably some, extreme medical stomach condition. And she says the name of what Dr. Otto gave her. And Carl's like, oh, those are Epsom salts. And he and Ruth laugh. End film.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very, very bizarre because like they're
Totally
because like the fight in the laboratory, basically like Emil is passed out on the trolley, and so there's this, when the scuffle happens, he jolts awake, and to me at least the implication is that he has like fully awoken from the hypnotism and remembers all the things that he's done. And then when he picks up the gun and shoots Otto and himself, to me, which also, we only hear that, he kind of tells Carl and Ruth, he's like, escape, go. And then they and then they hear the gunshots, because the idea that someone could kill someone and then themselves on camera is like, that would have been a lot for the time.
Yeah, you definitely could not show. suicide on
Yeah, but I
screen.
thought that that's like that was really kind of that was like very poignant, and for like a character that came from nowhere to then have this
I
really intense
know.
moment of like such intense guilt and shame that he would kill himself, and then there's just a joke about like, oh, silly women. Like,
Yeah, silly women, but also, oh, that classic Aunt Gussie.
yeah,
Yeah, and kind of going back to Borst a bit, who Dr. Otto's little underling thing. It keeps with sort of this interesting trend of like the big bad or the monster's little servant
yeah,
has to die kind of in the narrative. They
yeah,
might have a, not a change of heart even, because what's interesting is like these characters are often victims and
yeah,
um they did not want to murder or
yeah,
kill. In like poor Renfield's case, his mind was basically overtaken by a
yeah,
supernatural entity. But yes, they often die, and maybe have kind of a moral crisis, or they're like, I'm awake now and I can help the good guys. But yeah, so and then we get the very tonally dissonant ending.
yes, yeah.
So that was The Vampire Bat. Elliot, what did you think?
Um, I mean, it's one of those things where like it's just really interesting to see the way that storytelling has changed, because like yes, there is a plot to these films, but I feel like I'm seeing like a collection of scenes and moments, unless like I'm being carried through a story. We're saying like
Mm,
we don't get introduced to people, we don't get any sense of their lives or their interiorities of like what are they thinking and feeling. And so that was something that is, it'll be interesting to see when we start like learning who people are beyond their jobs.
yes.
Yeah, but I think for me, like one of the things that really sticks out about this film that I had, that I wrote some stuff about in my notes is just the kind of little window into portrayals of intellectually and developmentally disabled people in media. Yeah, because it's clear that that is what Herman is meant to be. We have this moment where when he there we've talked about a few moments, but there's this other moment in the garden where he and Gussie are interacting, and he cuts his finger, and she says, oh, you need to be careful about that like subcutaneous laceration, because that's how you get like, I can't remember, but
Tetanus.
she says the scientifically proper name for tetanus, and then she says the way you talk, it sounds like you have it already. um
Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, and I think some of the things that are, there's so much going on there. And I mean, the first is obviously that this is like very, very insensitive, and ableist, but it's also like it's very inaccurate. Like, I would say that this is very much the public's idea of a person with a developmental
Right.
or intellectual
Mm-hmm.
disability. um, which makes sense because at the time, and still to this day, but even more so at the time, our approach to disabled people in general, but was to keep them out of the public eye. So at this time period, we had things called the ugly laws, which is basically like regulating an ugly person's ability to be in public.
Oh God.
Yeah, and so like ugly would mean, people with physical differences. I don't want to use the word deformity because I think that that's like a
Mm-hmm.
word that a lot of people have. Like, are you really deformed if you like, are missing a limb or something like that? So
Mm-hmm.
there were those laws that kind of regulated what spaces you could appear in, and then for specifically intellectual and developmentally disabled people, um, a lot of those people spent their whole lives in either kind of very secluded in the home with their families, or in poorhouses, which were like state facilities. And then there were also psychiatric institutions that were called like schools or hospitals or homes for the quote like feeble-minded. And so that was like a diagnosable thing. Like science has come a long way. So at the time, Herman probably would have been read as someone who might have been diagnosed as feeble-minded or an imbecile or an idiot. I actually happened to do some archival research as part of an internship where we looked at records from a famous psychiatric institution in Pennsylvania called Pennhurst. And so many of the records, the diagnosis was just like idiot or imbecile or, and this is a term with an especially kind of violent and complicated history, but you would see the term mongoloid a lot.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Which was an early term. Well, the term's origin is from, biological racism, but then it kind of had like a second life as a term for people with Down syndrome and associated developmental disabilities. So like Herman is absolutely played for jokes. He's absolutely like played for a plot device to like keep us guessing about who the villain is. But I think that he is really representative of like the like some of the really ugly parts of this country's history when it comes to the treatment of disabled people.
Yeah, sadly that's very true, and I would agree that it is absolutely a reflection of society's attitudes to the disabled or differently abled at the time, which is very sad and still far too recent, and I think in our history.
Yeah, there are people who remember. Yeah, there are people who remember being patients at Pennhurst and like talk about the things that happened there. Yeah, and they're not even that old. These people.
Yeah, it's pretty horrific.
Yeah,
and kind of another thing or another trope that this film utilizes that has again kind of horrific real world connotations or it's sort of coming from that place is I say the term the mad scientist, which is it's a name for a trope of a character who is a scientist that is kind of disassociated from reality in terms of like wanting to achieve something impossible or great, and they are off and they eventually or are always using unethical means to do so.
Yeah.
And so I found this really great horror website, and I think it was started by an academic, Karina Wilson, and there was a section on 1930s horror movies. And she writes here, I'm going to quote from the website, and just a content wording for racism and unethical medical practices and torture. But she writes in regards to kind of this trend of the mad scientist, Dr. Frankenstein wasn't the only man trying to defy God and nature. Mad scientists pop up frequently in this decade's horror films. This reflected the ongoing cultural fascination with eugenics, the idea that the only way to prevent a future catastrophe for the human race was by selective breeding of the genetically superior and the forced sterilization of those with undesirable genetic traits. The Nazis weren't the only ones who agreed with this thinking. Many prominent citizens, from leaders at the Carnegie Institution and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation to President Roosevelt himself, put time, money, and energy into the eugenics cause. At the same time, the U.S. Public Health Service felt there was nothing wrong in conducting the now infamous Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which ran from 1932 to 1972, on 399 unsuspecting Black Americans. 128 died, 40 wives were infected, and 19 children born with congenital syphilis.
Yes, I think that's a really, really great thing to bring up, because like even though this film is entirely about white people, like the things that I just talked about with Herman, a lot of those things can be traced back exactly to the racism and the racist violence and exploitation that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, in regards to the Tuskegee medical syphilis
I think it's
experiment, Tuskegee, I'm sorry for the mispronunciation, Tuskegee. Um, but yes, you can read about it more online, but essentially, again, I'm just paraphrasing a little bit from Wikipedia here. It says that the Public Health Service started the study in 1932 in collaboration with Tuskegee University, a historically black college in Alabama. In the study, investigators enrolled a total of 600 impoverished African American sharecroppers from Macon County, Alabama. Of these men, 399 had latent syphilis, with a control group of 201 men who were not infected. As an incentive for participation in the study, the men were promised free medical care. While the men were provided with both medical and mental care that they otherwise would not have received, they were deceived by the PHS, who never informed them of their syphilis diagnosis and provided disguised placebos, ineffective methods, and diagnostic procedures as treatment for bad blood. The men were initially told that the experiment was only going to last 6 months, but it was extended to 40 years. None of the infected men were treated with penicillin, despite it being available in 1947. So yes, basically a form of, I would say, genocide or mass murder was being committed here, and
yeah, absolutely.
It's incredibly horrific, but
yeah,
it should be known. This needs to be part of our knowledge of history. And
yes, yeah. And I think a lot of people do know about the Tuskegee experiment, but probably not the full details. And people are also probably not aware that experiments, I say, like really kind of sadistic games, I would argue, that things like that happen like in prison as well. You know, like that was another very common population for deeply unethical, kind of like pointless, I would argue, scientific experiments. You know, was like the populations of incarcerated individuals, again largely black and, you know, people of color. And then also, you know, you mentioned forced sterilization. That is another kind of massive thing that people know very little about in American history, is that you know, we might think of forced sterilization as something that happens in other places or during events like the Holocaust, and it's like, well, actually, you know, like it wasn't uncommon for immigrant women to be sterilized without their knowledge during like births or surgical procedures, where, you know, like while they were under, a surgeon would just like give that person a hysterectomy or give that person a tubal ligation, and they would never know until maybe they tried to have a child in the future. And you use the term undesirable in the quote, like the word undesirable appeared in the quote, and like that is a word that appears in legal texts and documents, and was actually like, you know, bringing it back to these like, you know, poorhouses or these like homes and schools for the quote unquote feeble-minded. A lot of times one of the ways that a person could end up in those situations was if the court mandated it. So you might even see a court transcript that describes a person as undesirable and therefore like fit for commitment. You know, like, oh, this person isn't desirable for the public space. This person is, we don't want this person to have like a normal life and a family and children. So, yeah, all of these things are like very much interconnected. And it's really interesting that this, you know, that you found this source, because I had not necessarily thought about the connection between these events and this genre of the mad scientist.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And like I hadn't either until I read that little excerpt and went, oh yeah, media doesn't exist in a vacuum. The stories we tell don't come from nowhere. They are influenced by the culture and cultural interests and societal norms at the time. And yes, as we've been talking about at this time, there was a lot of fascination with eugenics, but there was also a lot of unethical medical practices, sterilization, experimentation, straight up just murder.
Yeah.
And like, you know, kind of like as Karina Wilson points out in the excerpt, you know, in the most extreme case, the Nazis with their fascination with superior races. And so you see how at the time humanity was defined by those in power and those with privilege, and how they were using that definition of who has humanity to delineate who does not. And it's pretty horrific, the outcomes of that.
Yeah, and I mean, mentioning the Holocaust is like, I think also an important point, because very, very obviously, like, the primary target of the Holocaust and mass killings was like people of the Jewish faith, and, you know, Jewish people, but there were other populations targeted, and the disabled were also a group targeted by the Nazis and targeted for mass extermination, including autistic people. And they were actually called, like, there's this documentary, or there was like, they were described as like bodies without souls, and that it was actually merciful to kill an autistic person.
I love the irony of like a Nazi mandate saying these are people without souls.
Yes, yeah. And fun fact, this is actually the origin of Asperger's, which is no longer a diagnostic term or like a diagnosable thing.
I did not know that.
Yeah, because there was this doctor who was I don't know like the full details of this, but my understanding is that there was a doctor who was kind of involved in these efforts and like studying intellectually and developmentally disabled people, and he was kind of in charge of like who got to live and who didn't, and he essentially differentiated between good autistic people and bad autistic people, and that he was like, well, there are some people who are autistic but like not that autistic, so like they don't really need to go to the chambers or be removed from society in the same way. And so that, like, and a lot of people, I didn't know this for many, many years. I don't think people know that this is where that term came from. So now in the DSM-5, Asperger's is not included. It is, everything is under autism spectrum disorder.
Okay.
Yeah, and so, you know, like, it's incredible that those things can go so unexamined, and that they can fly so under the radar, because like we have this predisposition to be like, oh, science, empiricism, like this is the facts, this is the data, like we should trust scientists. And it's like, well, scientists are people, and people have biases, and people have prejudices, and people are fallible to systemic oppressions, and they will bring that lens to their scientific work and twist it and pervert it to suit those prejudices.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I guess kind of in conclusion, sort of coming back to the film a little bit, would you consider this a vampire movie?
That is so, this is such an incredible question. Yeah, I mean, wow, because we did decide in the first mini episode that, well, no, we decided that a vampire has to consume blood to sustain life, which they maintain in the film, but there is no vampire. I think that, this is a good question. I think that this is still, I'm gonna say that I think this is still a vampire film, just because we spend so much of the time like looking for a vampire and like talking about blood drained victims and stuff. What is your thought?
It's hard because I'm leaning more towards no, because there is no actual vampire in the movie.
Yes.
There's no vampire in the movie, but I mean, as you said, it is a prominent theme, and there's a lot of discussion on vampires from kind of a scientific basis and their validity. There's a lot of vampiric motifs, like the bat. I mean, you could argue the Doctor is acting in a vampiric way by essentially draining blood from his victims to give life to this new life form.
Feeding on society. Yes. Wow.
So I think, gosh, I don't know. I'm going to lean more towards, I'm going to say no, but I understand your perspective, and if someone would classify this as a vampire film. And yeah, you know, vampire, I guess, doesn't even have to be in it if the theme of the vampire or the message of the vampire is true and strong.
Yes, the message. Well, I guess maybe a relevant question is, would you consider this a Frankenstein ripoff?
Ooh.
Because I think that Herman can very easily be read as like a stand-in for, or a reference to Fritz in Frankenstein, which only came out 2 years before this.
Yes, and Dr. Otto is very clearly a mad scientist in the vein of the 1930 to Dr. Frankenstein. Especially with the whole, like, I am creating life and I am God and this kind of moral superiority. So yeah, I would say much more as a Frankenstein. Like, he is so proud of this sponge that he has. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, you've made life? Have you? How long does that take to incubate? Yeah,
you made a blob.
Good for you. So yes. And yeah, that's kind of my final thoughts. Personally, I don't think it's a vampire film, but I think it's a B mad scientist film from the early 30s that Trojan horses with the vampire trend at the time.
Yeah, it's definitely it's an interesting film because it might be the case that because I think that one thing in film studies, especially recently, that especially in the horror space, is that we're kind of in a post-genre world now. So it's also entirely valid to just be like, this film might not have a genre and might be like a collection of references to familiar genres.
Right.
This one's a weird one. It's kind of hard to kind of put in a specific spot.
It is, and yeah, in the grand scheme of all vampire media, which we will be covering, I don't see myself coming back to this one or holding it in my brain space for much longer.
No. But we've given it all the attention it deserves.
Yeah, it is interesting how we are kind of coming out of, I think, the early initial, I guess I would say maybe sort of art house phase of early vampire films with movies like Nosferatu and Vampire. Even international vampire films like the Spanish language Dracula. And I think now we're getting into like more of the like Hollywood studio system, crank them out.
It's about the blood now.
Yeah, like lesser known vampire films from this time.
Yeah. Well,
all right.
Yeah, I am going to be so curious to see what you have to say about next week's film. I think it's a really interesting follow-up to some of the weirdness of this film. Yeah.
I'm so excited.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you for listening to another episode of This Podcast Sucks.
Find us where you get your podcasts on Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube. Follow us on social media and give us a like.
You can find us at That Vampire Pod on X, formerly known as Twitter, and Instagram. We'd love to hear from you guys. And remember, stay bloodthirsty.
Catch our next episode on Todd Browning's Mark of the Vampire.